Yeah, we had a very intense 2020 fire season. And there are two things that were really striking to me. We saw incredibly large fire events across the West that were breaking records in terms of their size in Colorado and in California. And we also saw really late burning wildfires. So, fires that got really large in October and that burned into November. That's a very late fire season. We've only seen in Colorado about a dozen fires that have gotten more than 10,000 acres that started in October, going back to the 1980s. So they're very rare to get that big. Seeing events that got over 100,000 acres in October with the East Troublesome Fire is very unusual. And so those two things, seeing really big record-breaking fires and seeing really late burning fires, are two signs to me that are indicating a larger trend, which is we're seeing an increase in burned area across the Western US that's directly linked to a warming climate. And we know that it takes just a little bit of warming to lead to a lot more burning. And this is true going back to the 1980s at least, where we've seen a doubling of forests that have burned since the 1980s. And that's directly linked to an increase in warming temperatures. And for Colorado in particular, it's important to recognize that fire is responding really quickly to climate change. And there are parts of Colorado that have seen an increase in temperature that's been more than the global average in temperature, particularly the western and northern parts of Colorado. We've seen some climate change hotspots where the increase in temperature has been actually way more than the global average increase in temperature. Yeah, our biggest fire years have all been in the 2000s. So and each year we've been breaking records, which is consistent with what we look for as scientists. We look for the trends across these longer decadal periods of time. And we have good fire information going back to the 1980s. In some states, we have good fire information going back to the 1970s. And so we look at, okay, well, what's the burned area total for every year going back that far? And what we've seen in 2020 is consistent with the trend of increasing burned area. And so if you ask me, oh, are we going to see more fire seasons like 2020? The answer is yes. We're very likely going to see more fire seasons to come that look like 2020. And the other big piece of the puzzle here is that we're also putting a lot of homes in harm's way. So we've done some work that showed there were over 1 million homes that were within wildfire boundaries over roughly a 20-year period. And there were another 59 million homes that were within a kilometer of those wildfires over the last roughly 20 years. So we continue to build in harm's way. So we really need to think now about how we're building into our flammable landscapes across the Western US. Yeah, there are a couple things going on when I say we need to build better. One, we need to think about where we're putting homes. So we've put a lot of homes that are like right up against flammable vegetation. Our ecosystems, especially here in Colorado, they're adapted to fire. They see fire on somewhat regular intervals between 30 to 100 or several centuries. So we do expect fire in our ecosystems. And when we put homes literally right up against flammable vegetation, we're setting ourselves up for disaster. So we need to rethink how we're building homes into flammable places. So, what's the constellation of homes within a neighborhood? How are we using roads? Are we using them as fuel breaks? What kinds of materials are we using to build homes? It costs the same to build a home that's fire resistant today in today's dollars as it does to build a more traditional home that's more flammable. So we need to think now about how we're incentivizing development into flammable places. And we love, we love our mountain landscapes. We love these beautiful conifer forests, but they're also really flammable. And so another thing we can think about doing is using, fuel management techniques around homes, removing fuels that are, the shrubs, the brush, the lower branches of trees, removing trees from around your home. These are all mechanisms to, increase the resilience of your home in the case of wildfire. And the other thing that we don't do nearly enough of is prescribed burning, using fire to fight future dangerous fire. Prescribed burning is a technique that was used for millennia by Native American communities to manage the flammable fuels in landscapes. That's something that we don't do nearly enough of to try and treat the fuel in and around where we live. Yeah, that's a really good question. So part of what happened this season is that we just had such dry conditions for so long, and even continuing now to today, like we don't have nearly enough moisture. So we're still in a drought condition and situation. And frankly, it doesn't matter necessarily if you have dead trees. What matters is like how dry that fuel is. And so given that we had really dry conditions, that was the setup that made those dead trees from beetle kill really, really flammable. Um, and yes, it does play some role, but it doesn't play as much of a role as you would think, surprisingly. It's actually really more about the background climate conditions and extremely dry and hot temperatures that are essentially promoting that fire spread through those fuels. If those beetle-killed trees weren't there, like we still would have had fast-moving fires moving through live trees because the winds were so strong and the background temperatures were so warm, it was so hot, and it had been dry for such long periods of time. So it's, when it comes down to fire, there are really three things that we need to think about, three ingredients really. So we need a warm and dry climate to promote fire, we need fuels to burn, and we need an ignition source. And climate can really override. And we can have fires burning through grasses, we can have fires burning through shrubs, we can have fires burning through forests. As long as there's enough fuel to burn, a really hot and dry climate can promote fires that are damaging. I was surprised, absolutely. I think part of the reason why I was surprised is, we've done some of the science about what do we expect and projections of future fire and extreme fire conditions. And we were predicting something like 2020, out many decades, and to see it happening so soon and so fast, that was the piece that was surprising as a fire scientist, is to see a fire season like 2020 now as opposed to several decades from now. And so what that means is like, the science is solid, but we're just seeing it a lot sooner and a lot faster than we had predicted. And I think one key thing is that, we're also breaking temperature records as well. We're not only breaking fire records, but we're breaking temperature records around the world in terms of how hot it is. And that to me directly signals what we should be concerned about in the here and now, which is the response of wildfires. And we need to rethink how we're living with fire and how we're going to live with continued increases in fire over the next several decades. There's a couple key messages here. One is that, yes, we're seeing the effects of climate change in the here and now through our fire seasons, which should hopefully motivate a reduction in fossil fuel emissions. But, we're kind of stuck with the fossil fuel emissions and the increase in temperature that we've essentially been generating over the last century or two. And so we have to live with this fire situation now. And, there's several things we can do over the next several decades. One is building better, restructuring how we build homes into flammable places. We have floodplain maps to direct development insurance, but we don't have firescape maps to help better direct development insurance. We need to think about managing fuels in and around where people live and work, focusing on backyard management, rather than forest management. There's no way we're going to remove, tens of millions of dead trees in Colorado. It doesn't make financial sense at all to try and do that. But what does make sense is to do fuel management and prescribed burning, around, where people live and work and around key ecosystem restoration ideas. We also need to think about the ignitions piece of the puzzle. That late in the fire season to see East Troublesome and the Calwood fire, we have an ignition problem, and most of those ignitions late in the fire season are coming from people. We're outside of the lightning storms and the lightning season when we move into September and October, November. Those are prime time conditions when we see human related ignitions. Those could be from infrastructure, they could be from debris burning or campfires or fireworks. So our everyday activities produce a lot of sparks that can start wildfires as well. So Smokey Bear did a great job talking about preventing wildfires in the middle of the woods, but now we need Smokey Bear, in the suburbs telling us, hey, you're using your lawn equipment can actually cause sparks that would start a wildfire. So that's another piece of the puzzle that we can help to fix. The other piece is supporting larger scale prescribed burning efforts. And I know everybody suffered a lot from the smoke this year. But the hope in that is like, oh, wow, that's the kind of smoke we can deal with, or we have to deal with in a big, intense fire season. It sure would be a lot better to deal with smoke in smaller packets distributed over a longer period of time through prescribed burning techniques. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And we're living with the larger issue of how do we want our smoke? We live in flammable places that are going to burn. It would behoove us to think about better managing our ecosystems with prescribed fire as one key tool. I think the only silver lining from the 2020 fire season is that I hope it helps to jolt us out of this emergency response mindset into more proactive planning and managing our firescapes in a more sustainable way, building better, emphasizing backyard management, bringing Smokey Bear to the suburbs, using fire to fight fire. These are all things that we can do. And so I'm hopeful that we as a society at large can take a more active role in planning for fire and thinking through some of the solutions to live more sustainably with fire in the future. Yeah, we're asking too much of our firefighters. Putting homes in harm's way, having an increase in warming conditions that make our landscapes more flammable, and then expecting our firefighters to solve this problem for us. It's too much to ask of them. And again, I hope that we can move and shift towards more proactive planning and thinking about fire now in the middle of the winter, when we can start planning and doing something about it for the future. Yeah, I think a big one is we also need to be thinking about, who's at risk, whose lungs are in harm's way and whose homes are in harm's way and who's prepared for wildfires and who's not. And particularly socially vulnerable Americans. There are an estimated 12 million socially vulnerable Americans who are, poorly equipped to respond to fire due to, lack of resources to do fuel treatment, or potentially they're renters living in, areas where they don't have control over, doing landscape management. So, we need to be thinking also about who's the most vulnerable to increasing fires and making sure that we're dedicating resources to help those people. Yeah, I mean, it's been such a challenging year and continues to be for so many people and for so many reasons. I think the thing that's um, important out of all of this is that unfortunately, we're also seeing the effects of compound disasters. Like what happens when you see COVID and wildfire at the same time, and what are the interactions there? COVID was forcing us to be outside with our families and our friends to, essentially try and be together in safe ways. But the smoke was forcing us inside. And so, we have these trade offs now as a function of simultaneous disasters that, I had not thought about before. Um, so that's one thing. But I do see reason for hope. Like I said, the silver lining in all of this is that we had a really intense fire season in 2020. We as people and as a society, we have the ability to adapt and change. And, I'm hopeful that we can find mechanisms to do that. I think that's one thing that marks, human societies for millennia is our ability to adapt and change. And so hopefully we can take the lessons from this year and become more resilient in the future.